We mentioned that Darwin came up with this idea of sexual selection, where some traits become common over generations and others become rare, not because they are advantageous or not in the environment, but because one sex prefers to mate with individuals that have them. And the two main aspects are you have competition between members of one sex for mating rights, where you might have, to take an example that some of you might have seen in Arkansas, male deer sprouting antlers and budding antlers together and fighting for access to females. Often it's the males that are competitive and the females that aren't. But there's a lot of exceptions to that rule, and we're going to see why in a bit. And then the other aspect is selection of mates by members of one sex. Often, but again, not always at all, this is females choosing which male they will accept as a mate. So this would be males perhaps displaying, singing songs or flashing colors, or doing utterly ridiculous dances, and females deciding which one they're going to mate with the brightest male or the craziest dancer or whatever the case might be. These can act independently of natural selection or together with it, or even in opposition to it. There we go. So here's an example. In the 70s, a guy named John Endler started looking at wild populations of Phacelia reticulata, otherwise known as the common guppy, which you might know from The Little Mermaid. Ah, you're such a guppy. Real guppies are very small, minnow-sized freshwater fish, native to the Caribbean. These populations are in Trinidad. And they're pretty easy to raise in freshwater aquariums. And if you go to any pet store, they're likely to have a pretty good selection of fancy guppies, where the males have big tails and brilliant colors and wild patterns. But this is what wild guppies look like. The females are just kind of silvery and kind of look like minnows. Males just have spots of color. And females prefer colorful males. Female will choose, given a choice of two males, a female will choose to mate with the one that is more colorful. Endler found that in populations that had few predators, the males tended to be more colorful. When he introduced predatory fish into guppy populations, the male guppies got less colorful over several generations. And that's because in that species, natural and sexual selection were acting in opposite directions. The more colorful a male guppy was, the more attractive he was to females and the more offspring he would leave. However, the easier target he was for visually hunting predators. So exactly where the balance lies is going to shift. When there's few predators present, sexual selection wins, and it tends to make the males more colorful. When there are lots of predators present, natural selection wins, and it tends to make the males more drab. So that's what I mean when I say that sexual and natural selection can pull in opposite directions. A rule of thumb that was worked out, and I think next week I'm going to give you guys a reading on this. You need to read more readings. A common rule of thumb is sometimes called Bateman's rule, named after a guy named Reginald Bateman, who documented this in fruit flies. And the rule is that Males usually are the ones that compete for females, like these male elk in the Canadian Rockies that are making these calls to attract females called bugling. And then, of course, fighting with each other by pushing with their antlers. So the males are competitive and the females are choosy. Females exert choice. The males compete with each other. Sometimes competition to the death, but often kind of ritualized combat, where instead of fighting to the death, the males might have a push fight with their antlers, or might just have a dance-off or something like that. Darwin was pretty sure that males were always competitive and females always selected the males that were the most beautiful. Suggested that these structures that must have been developed through sexual selection, such as the weapons of offense and the means of defense, possessed by the males for fighting with and driving away their rivals, their courage and pugnacity, their ornaments of many kinds, their organs for producing vocal or instrumental music, and their glands for emitting odors, most of these structures serving only to allure or excite the female. The thing is, there's a whole bunch of exceptions to Bateman's rule. Bateman's rule does not really work. Looking at the exceptions can give us a deeper understanding. And I'll demonstrate this in certain katydids and in an insect called the Mormon cricket. So called because it periodically rings your doorbell and asks to tell you about the golden plates. Actually, I'm joking. Mormon crickets, by the way, live out in the western US, and they can go through these population booms. I have driven through rural Nevada in spring, and if the Mormon cricket population is on, you have huge numbers of crickets crossing the road in certain areas, and the road can get downright slippery from these booms of Mormon crickets. They're called Mormon because when the Mormons settled in Salt Lake Valley, founding what would become Salt Lake City, they planted crops, and they were growing quite nicely, but then a whole bunch of Mormon crickets came and started eating their crops. Brigham Young, by the way, prayed for a miracle, and a bunch of seagulls came along and ate the Mormon crickets and saved the crops of the first settlers, which is why there is a monument to seagulls in the middle of Temple Square, Salt Lake City, if you ever go there for a visit. It's a more interesting place than it might seem. But anyway, that's why those are called Mormon crickets, even though they're not actually members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What they do is this: male katydids don't just produce sperm, they produce, they're insects, so they live on land, which means they can't just release sperm into the water to swim around. And in fact, insect sperm don't have tails anyway. And many organisms that are like that produce sperm packets to keep the sperm alive until the female can get to them. And so a male katydid produces a sperm packet called a spermatophore, and it's attached to a spermatophylax, which is this big lump of protein. And relative to body size, it's huge. A spermatophylax might be 25% of a male's total body weight. When they mate, the male sticks the spermatophore into the female's passage, and the female can then eat the spermatophylax, which is rich in protein and quite nutritious. This is a species where the females are competitive, where the females will fight with each other for access to the largest males, which are the ones that can produce the biggest spermatophylaces. And the competition is strongest when food is scarce. If the females are well fed, they may not compete very hard. If the females are not very well fed, it's Britney, bitch. The competition can be quite ferocious, and the females can injure each other. So that's what that looks like. There's a female that just mated. The spermatophore, I think, is what's at the top, and hanging down from it is the tasty spermatophylax that represents as much as a quarter of her mate's body weight. And she will bend around and eat that spermatophylax. Okay, if you want a slightly less disturbing example, fish in the family Syngnathidae include seahorses and pipefish. Pipefish are like seahorses, but they don't swim vertically and they don't have those curves that make them look like they've got a horse's head. They're very long. Like seahorses, they've got fused jaws with a little mouth that's kind of like a straw. And like seahorses, the males take care of the eggs. Females lay the eggs inside a specialized pouch on the male's belly. And the male fertilizes them, but the male also carries them around. The male also expends a lot of energy caring for the eggs because the male provides oxygen to them. I'm not entirely sure how the trick is done, but he's able to move oxygen from his own bloodstream to the eggs to keep them alive and well oxygenated. This is another species where females compete with each other for access to the choicest males. And males are choosy about which females they will mate with. That's another Bateman's rule reversal. And a better look at the rules, you probably don't remember this, but about 20 years ago, this book came out called The Rules, which was a bunch of rules that women were supposed to adopt in order to make sure they snagged a very high quality husband. And they included things like, be coy, keep him hanging on, play with him a little bit, but don't have sex with him on the first date, things like that. It was considered kind of regressive. And yeah, it was real popular. There were like rules clubs and things like that. And then a couple of years later, everybody forgot about it. But the real rules seem to be that, first of all, whichever sex invests more energy in reproduction will have fewer opportunities to reproduce. And again, that comes with what we started with at the very beginning, which is that organisms don't have infinite resources and they've got to allocate them. And they will evolve to allocate them in certain ways. Whichever sex has to invest more in each reproductive act can't reproduce as often. Selection will favor behavior patterns by the sex that invests more, that select only high quality mates. If you've only got one chance to reproduce and you mate with total loser slimeball, well, you're not likely to leave many offspring. On the other hand, if you've got only a few chances to reproduce and you mate with, totally awesome genetic Mac Daddy mate, you are likely to have more offspring that will survive because they'll be of high quality. Often, the sex that invests more is the female for reasons that I talked about earlier. It costs more to make one egg than one sperm because by definition, eggs are bigger. Eggs also often contain not just the cytoplasm and nucleus that will become the embryo itself, but they may contain an awful lot of yolk, right? Birds in particular, the female eggs, an egg is one cell. And the egg contains lots of yolk and lots of white, and that's all going to be an energy source for the developing baby bird. A bird's sperm is just a few microns in size. It's not really different in size from human costs a lot more energy to make an egg than a sperm. And notice that in Mormon crickets and in pipefish, that rule is reversed. Eggs still cost more than sperm, but in species like that, the males are investing more. The males are making, the Mormon cricket males have to make that huge spermatophylax that may weigh as much as a quarter of their whole body weight. The males in pipefish not only have to carry those eggs around and ultimately open up that pouch and give birth, which is exhausting, they also have to supply those eggs with oxygen. It's not quite the same as nourishing them through a placenta, but they do have to do a lot of physiological work to keep those eggs alive. So in species where the male invests a lot, the male is likely to be choosier and the female is likelier to be competitive. Whichever sex invests less energy in reproduction, I'll actually have more to say about this later, but there's a whole community of people called pickup artists who basically try to have sex with as many women as possible. And there's various psychological tricks that supposedly will help you do this, although I don't know, probably not. Anyway, whichever sex invests less can increase its fitness by reproducing as often as possible. If you can produce lots and lots and lots of sperm, and it doesn't cost you much to make each one, the theory goes you might as well spread them around and go for quantity over quality. And that difference between what you might call the strategic interests of the sexes is called asymmetry of sex. Males and females are not playing the same, they're not evolved to play the same strategy for maximizing reproductive output. Now, I should add something here really quick because I've just mentioned pickup artists. One of the things that you'll see if you get into this, not that I hope anybody really does, because pickup artists are seriously skeevy, but books like this contain a lot of advice as to how you can bag lots of women using evolutionary biology. And they'll tell you things like this, that, you know, it's in a woman's interest to be choosy, so you have to come up with ways to flaunt the fact that you are high status because females are choosy towards males that can provide resources, and here's how you can look like you can even if you're really a total loser. They use a type of evolutionary biology argument. Usually they don't use it very well, and it's done very simplistically. Humans are an extremely complicated species, and for right now, try not to anthropomorphize the content of the next couple of lectures, because it's easy to think, oh yeah, you know, males competitive, females choosy, and apply that to the behavior of, I don't know, a bunch of drunks bumping chests at a dive bar. You know, while the female's sitting around going, ooh, yes, he's got good muscles, but what's his salary? You know, that plays into certain stereotypes that we have of the way humans behave. And you have to be very careful not to take your own stereotypes and read those into the natural world. Non-human species are what they are, and they do what they do. Human behavior is influenced by our evolutionary past, but it's not determined by it. And human behavior can take some extremely complicated forms. Do your best not to assume that what I'm talking about in this part of the course applies to any sort of implication, or, God's help us all, any sort of like moral guidance as to how humans are supposed to behave. Try to keep humanity out of this for right now. There's actually an entire field that tries to use evolutionary reasoning to explain human behavior. It's now called evolutionary psychology. And it has made some amazing discoveries. It's also thrown up some absolute shit. and it's used in ways that I think are really bad and very misleading by the authors of books like this, who are just, basically just sex collectors. And we'll get into that later, but try not to jump to conclusions about what people do based on what organisms do, because people are exceptionally weird. We are biologically total freaks. We're completely goofy. Okay, so a better rule is that whichever sex has less to invest will be competitive and seek out more opportunities to reproduce. Whichever sex has more to lose will be choosy and prefer mates of higher genetic quality rather than mating as often as possible. Or as the old joke goes, it takes a woman 9 months to have a baby, no matter how many men you put on the job. Very old and kind of fatuous and stupid joke, I might add. And we see that in cases where Bateman's rule is reversed, like the pipefish, like British moorhens, a type of bird where the males are the ones that sit on the eggs and incubate them, and females compete for access to the warmest and dumpiest males. We get to European midwife toads, where the males carry the eggs in soft, spongy tissue that grows on their backs, and females compete for access to the males with the biggest, spongiest backs. It happens all over the place. We see reversals of Bateman's rule. But in the real world, the rules are there's no rules, just right. So many other factors can affect the way that sexual behavior evolves that any rule you're going to come up with is loaded with exceptions. And any rule is going to be only the most general rule of thumb. Evolution is not obligated to always come up with nice, neat, and simple rules for you. So there's the Australian redback spider, Latrodectus hasseltii. Crikey, she's mad now. That's the same genus as black widows, species that we have around here. In particular, in the first place my wife and I lived, we had quite a lot of them in the garden. Yeah, just want to be careful where you're putting your fingers if you're turning over rocks or something like that. And yeah, this one is deadly because this is Australia and everything is freaking deadly. And like our black widows, the female is quite large. The male is much smaller, and he's not quite as small as the parasitic males of deep sea anglerfish, but he's very small. He doesn't live as long. He's only going to live a couple of months. And for spiders to reproduce, the male has, well, spiders have a pair of appendages. They look like legs, but they're not. They're called the pedipalps. And male spiders will have specialized structures on the pedipalps that they can fill with a sperm drop. And then male spider has to insert his pedipalp into the female's genital opening to transfer sperm. The geometry of this act is such that for a male redback spider to mate, he has to crawl right onto the female and do a back somersault directly onto the female's jaws. As the male copulates, the female eats him. This is known as sexual cannibalism, or sometimes as copulatory suicide. You may not remember this song, which I think was late 70s. Whoa, here she comes. She's a man-eater. Oh, here she comes. Yeah, well, redback spiders really are. And you might be wondering how this can be adaptive. You might predict that since males produce sperm, which are energetically cheap, that it might make more sense for a male to try to mate as often as possible rather than just mating once and allowing himself to get eaten. You'd think a male that ran away and lived to mate again might need more offspring. But it turns out that if a female eats a male, she is less likely to accept another male. If a female is well fed, she will lay more eggs and be able to care for them better if she has good nutrition. And pity the poor guy that actually timed this. When the male is being eaten, copulation actually goes on longer, which means that he can transfer more sperm. He will actually leave more offspring if he just lies there and lets himself be devoured, rather than if he inserts his pedipalp and immediately runs away. Right? He will leave more offspring if he doesn't run. Incidentally, where a male does survive, he never feeds and eventually dies of starvation. So males that survive don't even try to mate again, because copulatory suicide works. This is a desert-dwelling spider. They're not, their distribution is pretty sparse. Something like 40% of all males never find a female at all. And a male that does find a female is just unlikely to ever find another one. Lightning doesn't strike twice. So males that let themselves be eaten will have more offspring than males that try to mate multiple times. There's another example for you. That's a microscopic arthropod called a pseudoscorpion. Here, females mate with multiple males. Now, because females produce relatively few eggs, females mating with multiple males doesn't normally increase fertility. All right, a female that mates with multiple males, in theory, should not have more offspring than a female that mates with only one. But in this species, you have some kind of genetic incompatibility, which means that not every male-female pairing is going to give you offspring. So a female that mates with multiple males has better odds of leaving offspring than a female that mates with a single one. So in that case, we don't get what we might predict from Bateman's rule. Female promiscuity actually makes sense. Okay, I tell you what, I will stop there. We do have more rules to go over, but I'll just leave you with the message that natural and sexual selection can not only explain physical features of organisms, we can interpret aspects of behavior and aspects of the life cycle and life history in that light as well. And don't forget, on Tuesday, that's tomorrow, first thing I want us to do is be ready to discuss the readings, please. And then we'll talk about this some more. We'll do lecture tomorrow and Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, since I cannot be here, you have labs that you can do independently.